That morning, the atmosphere in Charity Hospital was incredibly noisy. The loudspeaker blared noisily, continuously calling the names of patients for their appointments. But it seemed no one noticed. An elderly woman stood in a hidden corner of the main hall. The old woman wore worn clothes. Worn and faded with time. And worn-out sandals. Making her look like a ghost. In that hurrying crowd, everyone around her were preoccupied with their own affairs. Patients and their relatives. Hospital staff, all were hurried and busy. No one noticed her small, tired figure. Her gaze, with an anxious look, trying to find help. But no one stopped. The old woman quietly made her way to the reception desk. Her trembling legs took small, hesitant steps. Her wrinkled, thin hands clasped tightly together, as if trying to keep herself from falling. The people around her didn't even notice her presence. There were only the sounds of hurried footsteps and the loud chatter of others, making the atmosphere feel congested and cold. When she reached the reception desk, the old woman softly spoke. Weak and tired, but full of entreaty. "Miss, could I borrow a phone to call home? I'm separated from my grandchild and I don't know how to let them know." The receptionist was looking down at her computer screen, startled slightly when she heard the request. She looked up, her eyes flicking briefly over the old woman, and then quickly returned to her work. Even though the old woman was standing right in front of her, the old woman's eyes were full of pleading. She remained unmoved. She just glanced briefly at the old woman, seeing her worn clothes and her thin hands. Without a shred of sympathy, she curtly replied, "This isn't a place to borrow phones. If you want to make a call, go find somewhere else outside. I'm busy." Those words were like an invisible knife, cutting into the old woman's heart. The receptionist's voice was cold and lacking any sympathy, making the old woman stunned for a moment. The gazes of those around her began to turn towards her. And that attention wasn't concern or help, but curiosity and annoyance. A few mocking whispers arose. "Who is this woman? She looks like a homeless person. Doesn't have a phone and yet she's at the hospital. Probably just putting on an act to beg." The whole atmosphere felt oppressive. The people around her didn't realize that the old woman simply needed help. They only saw an old woman, poor, and treated her as if she didn't deserve help. The old woman heard those words. Her eyes reflected disappointment. But she didn't say anything more. She just stood there silently, then lowered her head, trying to hide the hurt in her heart. She slowly backed away a step, leaving the reception desk. She found an empty seat in the waiting area, where few people would notice her. Her lonely figure was like a faint shadow, lost amidst the hurrying crowd. Her thin hands still clutched tightly at the hem of her shirt. Her cloudy eyes stared ahead, but her gaze was unfocused, simply searching for something. She didn't utter a word, didn't blame anyone. The people around her continued with their lives. No one noticed her presence. Some even chuckled, not understanding that behind that worn appearance and those wrinkled hands was a human being, a story and a heart. Meanwhile, the old woman just sat there, her eyes vacant, staring out the door, not knowing what she was waiting for. The distant noises, the loudspeaker calling patients' names, the chatter of the crowd no longer held her attention. The thoughts in her head were only worries about her grandchild, about the things she hadn't had time to say, about what she wanted to tell her family. Suddenly, in the quiet, A soft chuckle came from behind. A middle-aged man, wearing an expensive coat, walked past the old woman and paused for a moment. He glanced at her with a look of contempt, and said mockingly, "I really don't understand why this old woman doesn't have a phone. A phone is the most basic thing, everyone has one. And yet she has to borrow one here." His laughter was contemptuous, like an insult to the old woman. Some people standing nearby, thinking it a joke, also laughed along. Their gazes weren't just mockery, but also a lack of understanding. Apathy to the point that no one realized that the old woman was living out her final days, with very little help. A few minutes later, a young, fashionably dressed woman, with the latest model phone in her hand, walked closer. She looked the old woman up and down, with a disapproving expression. She spoke softly, her voice dripping with sarcasm, almost as if only to herself. "Look at her. How could she possibly be separated from her grandchild? She must want to borrow a phone to do something. Who would believe that?" Those words weren't just mockery, but also a lack of compassion. Both the man and the woman didn't realize that the old woman wasn't a con artist. She was just a frail old woman, trying to contact her family. In her confusion and distress, the old woman still sat there, silently enduring, not protesting, not blaming anyone. But deep down, she felt the pain spreading. For her, it wasn't the mocking words of others that hurt the most. The greatest pain was the feeling of abandonment, of being disregarded, worthless. She knew that society no longer gave her much attention, as it once had. But she still couldn't understand why ordinary people could be so indifferent, even to someone like her. Someone simply in need of help. Not long after, the old woman bowed her head, holding her breath, trying to hold back the tears that threatened to spill. She didn't want those around her to see her weakness. She had lived her whole life without ever showing her suffering. But today, she felt the strength of her resilience was dwindling. In that moment, a security guard walked by. He saw the old woman sitting there. But instead of helping, he just glanced at her suspiciously. After a moment, he stopped and approached the old woman. "What are you doing here for so long? Is something wrong?" the security guard asked indifferently. The old woman looked up, her cloudy eyes meeting his, her voice weak. "Sir, I want to borrow a phone to call my grandchild. I'm separated from my grandchild." Her words hung in the air, soft but full of pleading. However, the security guard just glanced at her impatiently. He frowned, then sighed, and said quickly, "There are no phones to borrow, ma'am. This hospital isn't a place for you to deal with trivial matters. Go somewhere else." Those words again felt like invisible knives stabbing into the old woman's heart. She just remained silent, saying nothing more. She lowered her head. Disappointment silently filled her eyes. No one understood her suffering. No one realized that those harsh words and gazes were slowly causing her pain. Not physical, but emotional. She could only sit there alone in the cold room. No one cared. No one came near to ask how she was, although she could still feel the coldness of those around her. But she no longer had the strength to face them. In her heart, a tiny spark of hope for help from those around her had slowly died out. But then a miracle happened while the old woman was still sitting there. A boy of about 12 years old, carrying a bag of food, entered with his mother. The boy was not like the others. Not in a hurry, not engrossed in his phone. Or his personal interests. The boy walked towards the old woman. His eyes looked at her with obvious concern and compassion. Unlike other gazes. The boy's gaze held an understanding that not everyone seemed to possess. The boy tugged on his mother's hand and whispered softly. "Mom, that grandmother looks so pitiful. Should we ask her if she needs anything?" The mother hesitated for a moment when she saw the old woman. But when she saw her son's eyes, she smiled. She understood that her son wanted to do a kind deed. And she couldn't refuse this request. She nodded gently and followed the boy towards the old woman. "Grandma, do you need any help? Is there anything we can do for you?" The mother asked, her voice soft and her eyes full of sincerity. The old woman looked up. Her eyes momentarily brightened. As if she had seen a ray of light in the darkness. She smiled weakly. Her hands trembling as she opened her mouth to reply. "Thank you, child. I just need to borrow a phone to call my grandchild." The mother didn't hesitate for a second. She took out her phone and handed it to the old woman. Without any hesitation. In that moment, the old woman realized that kindness and generosity still existed. Despite so much indifference and apathy around her. The old woman's hands trembled as she took the phone. Her voice choked with emotion as she said thank you. "Thank you so much, child." The old woman dialed her grandson's number. Her hand trembled as she lifted it to her ear when the ringing tone sounded. She couldn't contain her emotions. At this moment, she wasn't just calling her grandchild. But it was also a call from the heart. A message from someone who was eagerly awaiting a reunion with her family. She couldn't hide the joy in her eyes. Her eyes lit up when she heard the answer from the other end of the line. "Hello, it's Grandma. I'm at the hospital. Can you come pick me up?" It was a short but blissful moment. That was the moment the old woman realized that even though society could be indifferent, there were still people like the boy and his mother who saw the value of kindness and compassion. The boy stood beside her, his eyes innocent, looking at the old woman with deep empathy. He didn't understand everything in life. But there was one thing he understood clearly. Kindness doesn't need a reason. It doesn't need a special relationship. It just needs a heart that cares and shares. The boy looked at the old woman with that look. And in that moment, he learned a priceless lesson about kindness, compassion, and love. Right after the old woman made the call, the atmosphere in the hospital suddenly changed. A shiny black luxury car sped through the busy street and parked right in front of the entrance of the hospital. The screech of brakes rang out, attracting the attention of everyone around. Curious eyes started to focus on the car. The car door opened, and a middle-aged man stepped out of the car. With a dignified appearance, wearing an elegant black suit, his shoes gleaming, and from his posture, one could immediately tell that he was a person of status in society. His face clearly showed anxiety, and his eyes constantly scanned the hospital lobby, as if searching for someone very important. Behind him were two assistants, their arms carrying many documents and bags, hurrying after him, further increasing everyone's attention. The man stopped when he saw the old woman sitting quietly in the waiting area. In that moment, he rushed towards her, his face filled with emotion and worry. "Mother. Why are you here alone? I've been looking for you all morning." Everyone around suddenly fell silent. They couldn't believe their eyes. This man with a powerful and elegant appearance was rushing and anxiously searching for the old woman. The story now took a major turn. The old woman maintained her composure, but the corner of her lips formed a faint smile. I just came here for a quick checkup. But I didn't know how to call home. They wouldn't let me borrow a phone. The man, having just heard this, his face briefly shifted from worry to anger. He turned to look at the crowd around him with a sharp gaze, full of indignation. Didn't anyone here let this old woman borrow a phone? My mother only asked for one phone call, and everyone refused. Why did the atmosphere in the hospital lobby suddenly become silent? The entire crowd was stunned, unsure of what to do. A few people in the crowd began to lower their heads, their eyes avoiding the receptionist, who had refused the old woman, was now pale, unable to utter a word. The man continued, his voice filled with anger. My mother has dedicated her life to helping the poor. She is the founder of the largest charity foundation in this country. She helped build this hospital. She has helped thousands of people. And today my mother is treated like this. Those words made the atmosphere in the hospital lobby fall silent. Those who had mocked the old woman now hung their heads in regret. They realized that the old woman was not homeless, not a scammer, but a woman with a kind heart, and had contributed so much to society. Although she didn't say anything else, the old woman still smiled kindly. She didn't blame anyone, just spoke softly to her son. Son, don't be angry with them. I'm old and I don't get angry at anyone. I just hope they understand that sometimes helping another person doesn't matter who they are. That's what I've always taught you since you were little, remember? Her gentle words didn't contain any reproach or anger. Instead, they carried a message full of love and forgiveness. She wasn't just teaching her son, but also a valuable lesson for everyone present there, that kindness, help shouldn't discriminate between the poor and the rich, between acquaintances and strangers. That is a virtue that we all should learn and cherish. As she and her son prepared to leave, everyone still stood there. No one dared to look up at her. Her story, though painful and full of cruelty, had changed them forever. Especially the receptionist, who had treated the old woman coldly at first. She stood there, her lips trembling, unable to utter an apology. But her eyes, full of regret, said it all. She didn't need to say the words "I'm sorry," because she knew what the old woman had taught her. Not through words, but through her actions. At that very moment, a young man, who had earlier filmed a video when the old woman was refused, stepped towards her and bowed his head. Ma'am, I'm sorry. I shouldn't have laughed at you. I was wrong. The apology was sincere and not just for her, but also for himself. He realized that sometimes our carelessness can hurt others without us realizing it. But the important thing is to recognize our mistakes and correct them so that we can live better. Kinder, immediately afterwards, another woman, the receptionist, also couldn't contain her emotions. She burst into tears and walked towards the old woman, her voice choked with sobs. Ma'am, I'm truly sorry. I didn't know who you were. But now I understand. I apologize for treating you poorly. The old woman, like a kind mother, looked at the girl with eyes full of compassion. She placed her hand on the girl's shoulder and said softly, Child, anyone can make mistakes. The important thing is that you realize it and correct it. I'm not angry with you. Those words were like a deep forgiveness. She didn't reproach, she wasn't sad, but only hoped that, through their mistakes, people would realize the value of compassion and kindness. What we need to give each other in life. When the old woman and her son left, the atmosphere in the hospital seemed to change completely. The people around couldn't forget the image of the old woman. A frail old woman, but still lived with an open heart, without a trace of anger or resentment. Some hospital staff began to reflect on themselves, wondering if they had enough compassion and empathy to treat those in need. Like the old woman. The old woman's story didn't just stop at the receptionist, apologized, but sowed the seeds of awakening in everyone's hearts. From then on, many people in the hospital, from doctors and nurses to security guards, all began to change their perspectives on others. They no longer valued wealth or poverty, or someone's appearance, but instead, an attitude of respect, compassion and understanding. Just a week later, in the same hospital lobby, people saw the receptionist from that day was smiling and welcoming elderly patients. She didn't just help them with dedication, but also proactively checked on them, conversing, creating a friendly space, and warm for everyone. She had learned an important lesson from the old woman. That kindness isn't something overly grand, but sometimes small actions, but bring immense value. A young doctor, who had stood silently, witnessing the old woman being humiliated, without daring to intervene, now also proactively participate in the hospital's charity activities. He said to his colleagues, "I don't want to just stand by and watch anymore. It's time for us to act. We can't keep watching those who need help without doing anything." The young doctor realized that if he didn't act right now, if he didn't change his attitude and approach, then the old woman's story would forever be just a sad memory. Not just in the hospital. The old woman's story had spread outside, became a topic of conversation in families, among friends and the community. Everyone began to realize that compassion isn't just a lofty concept, but a real thing that we can practice every day. In every action, every word, every gesture. The old woman's story, though filled with suffering and sadness, but also a message of forgiveness, tolerance and unconditional kindness. This is the most important lesson that she wanted to leave for future generations. And also thanks to that story, that the people who were once indifferent, who had once insulted the old woman, now know how to appreciate and spread love, compassion to those around them. Ladies and gentlemen, this story isn't just a lesson for young people, but also a reminder of precious values that older generations can pass down to the next. Here are the values drawn from the story. Forgiveness and tolerance. Even when humiliated, the old woman didn't get angry but chose tolerance, reminding us that kindness will help maintain peace in the soul. 2. Kindness knows no bounds, despite poverty and old age. The old woman still helped others to show that age is not a barrier to living a meaningful life. Empathy and understanding. The story emphasizes that we shouldn't judge others by their appearance, but we need to understand and empathize. 4. Compassion in the community. Kindness helps connect generations and build community. Love enriches everyone's lives. 5. The importance of family. Relationships between generations need to be nurtured with care and respect from descendants. For the elderly. 6. Teach descendants about compassion. Older people can teach the value of compassion, kindness and responsibility to the next generation. Dear viewers, today's story is a reminder of the power of compassion, tolerance and empathy. Although life has its challenges, let's always treat each other with love and respect. Because when we live kindly, not only do we help others, but also make our own lives more meaningful. Thank you for watching the Light of Life channel. And don't forget to spread these good values in your daily lives. See you in the next videos.